Welcome to today's webinar on HR advice, workplace investigations and appeals. So I hope you're having a good morning. Let's get started. First off with the housekeeping of today's session. So you'll notice that your microphone is automatically muted. So if you need a cough or sneeze or anything, don't worry. You're not going to interject anything that we're doing today. So feel free, even if you're singing along to the radio, you're absolutely fine. I've also attached a handout, one in black and white, one in colour. If you download that now, it's got all the slides, including useful links for you to click on for further information on different topics. Also, if you send us your questions using that speech bubble and that question mark, we'll be able to answer them directly at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have enough time to cover your question, we'll be in touch with you afterwards. Don't worry. So what are we going to be covering today then? Well, today we're going to be focused on understanding workplace investigations. We're going to be looking at roles and responsibilities in the investigation process. We're looking at risk management and challenges in the investigations, evidence gathering and data protection, also investigation timelines and reporting. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the appeals process and some case examples as well. Now, you may have seen me before. My name is Matt. I'm a learning facilitator here at Sage, and I'm also joined by Advisor Plus HR technical consultant Hannah Johnson and senior HR advisor Millie New. They're going to share their expertise on addressing investigations and appeals for disciplinary matters. So Hannah, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hi everybody, my name's Hannah. So prior to working for Advisor Plus, I worked within management within a hotel chain. Since joining Advisor Plus 10 years ago, I've supported a variety of different business types, including telecommunications, manufacturing, and then also financial services. I have a level 5 CIPD, and my current role within Advisor Plus involves supporting the advisory team with complex and high-risk cases and focusing on upskilling and training too.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. My name is Millie. I have worked in HR now for 7 years. I have a level 5 CIPD qualification, and my role at Advisor Plus is a senior HR advisor, which means I work on the advice line, supporting clients with their employee relation needs, covering many topics such as the ones we're going to be covering today, along with probation, performance management and flexible working, etc.
Superb. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Now, we will make sure that at the end of the webinar, you can access the slides that we're going to be using. As I said, that's going to be attached on the handout. We're also going to be sharing the webinar recording with you as well, so you can watch it back on demand and share general do's and don'ts and links to the portal for the policies and areas that you may need to pay particular attention to. I'm going to be sharing on how to access that at the end of the session also. But for now, I think with it being 3 minutes past 11, let's get going. So, Hannah, can you start by talking us through what an investigation actually is?
Yeah. So first off, I want to talk through the investigation and what this looks like within an organisation. So an investigation is a process to collect all the relevant information on a matter to enable an employer to make a decision on one or more of its employees on how to progress forward. So the investigation can be required due to confrontational issues such as disciplinary or grievance, and it can also arise as part of a whistleblowing disclosure as well. A disciplinary will start with an alleged conduct issue, progress to an investigation before moving on to a hearing if there is a case to answer. Should a sanction or termination be decided, the employee will have the right to appeal, and we'll talk more about appeals kind of later on in the session today. The importance of an investigation is to establish the facts. So what has happened, when it happened, where it happened, and how. The scope of an investigation may also include the consideration of consequences of the alleged incident on others and the business as a whole, along with additional factors such as who was involved, are there any witnesses, is the employee aware of this, is this a recurring issue for them, and what evidence is available to be reviewed at that moment in time.
That's quite a lot to cover, isn't it? So, Melissa, what's the role of the investigator?
Okay, so to put it simply, the key role of the investigator is to establish the facts, to gather all of the evidence, and then to collate all of the findings to allow the business to make a decision on these findings. So the ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures sets out a minimum procedure which should be followed by a business as part of the disciplinary and grievance process. And I would also point out that be mindful that an employment tribunal will take into consideration whether that code has been complied with, and a financial award can be uplifted by up to 25% if it finds that there has been an unreasonable failure to comply with the code. In addition to the code, ACAS also has further supportive guidance, such as a guide on carrying out workplace investigations or interviewing witnesses. So some really good content there from ACAS. The aim of a disciplinary investigation is to only establish the facts. So it's not to determine any formal outcome, because that will be done separately in a formal disciplinary process. It is just to establish the facts. Whereas the aim of a grievance investigation is to establish if there's any evidence which supports or substantiates the allegations within the grievance itself, and then to recommend and decide on any appropriate action from there. So the ACAS Code for Disciplinary sets out that ideally there should be a separate person to carry out the investigation and the formal disciplinary parts of the process. So this is one to consider for the smaller businesses and organisations who may not have many people who haven't already been involved in the situation. And however, slightly different in a grievance process, the ACAS Code of Practice does not outline any legal requirements for the person investigating the grievance to be separate to the person who hears the grievance and delivers the outcome.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. So does that mean that anybody can carry out the investigation?
So some organisations may wish to identify somebody completely independent of the individual. For example, if it's a high profile grievance, for example. Others may choose to lean on the line manager of the colleague if they haven't already been involved in the issue or the issues being raised. As a business, you need to consider if there's any conflict of interest of whether the leader in the position can complete a fair and unbiased investigation before selecting the right person to complete that investigation. Businesses will also need to consider the facts and the disputes, who the allegation is against, and what your internal policies state in regard to who will carry out that investigation. They may need to also consider around holding, have they had any training of doing formal meetings as well, and also the seriousness of the allegations. The ACAS Investigations Guide sets out a number of questions that a business should consider when appointing an investigation manager. These questions support the businesses in ensuring that the right person is appointed. Some of these questions include, would that appointment raise a conflict of interest? Do they have good knowledge of internal and relevant processes and policies? Are they likely to be influenced by colleagues involved in the matter? Have they had the necessary training, experience to be able to carry out this investigation? And from a practical standpoint, are they going to have the availability as meetings should be held within a reasonable time frame?
Yeah, those are some really good points, Hannah. And to add to that, just to re-emphasise an earlier point, the investigation manager should be independent so far as it is practicable. And I do appreciate that with, some smaller businesses, this won't always be easy to identify who that investigation manager might be. It will be dependent on the size of the business, the seniority of the colleagues accused and those who have raised the complaints. Wherever it is possible, the investigation manager should be completely independent and should not have had any prior involvement in the incident itself. It is important, therefore, for smaller businesses to consider the appropriate roles of management from the very start. So take some consideration into who will be your note takers, formal hearing managers, and also who will be an independent appeal manager, as this will allow you as a business to appropriately appoint management. And it also allows the managers then to understand what their potential roles and responsibilities are going to be.
So what if the colleague doesn't like the investigation manager? Could they potentially request a change?
Oh, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So it's not unreasonable, but there needs to be some real mitigation put forward as to why the manager isn't the appropriate person to hold the meeting. So best practice would be to understand why the employee is requesting the change and is there substance to this concern. So I supported on a case recently whereby the investigation manager was geographically quite a distance from the employee, but they'd said that they were happy to hold the investigation over Teams. The colleague had refused this as they worked in the office on site 5 days a week and felt that they could put their points across better face to face. I advised the manager that was holding the meeting face to face it was a reasonable request and it would be appropriate to identify a manager who could complete the investigation face to face. We then changed the manager and the case then progressed quickly. Another example would be if there was a sensitive sexual harassment case as well. I again had one recently where the employee involved requested an investigation manager to be the same sex gender as them, which again was a reasonable request given the circumstances.
And what about notice periods for investigation meetings?
So from a statutory perspective, there's no notice periods or invite letters that are required from investigation meetings. Good practice would be to invite in writing and outline the reason for the meeting and who will be present. An organisation that I worked with recently did utilise invite letters for both the colleague and subsequently any witnesses that they were bringing in part of that investigation. This was an agreement that they had with the union, so it's always best to check your company's local policies before proceeding.
And Hannah, as the HR technical consultant, what would you be looking at in terms of risk at investigation stage?
So we find that a lot of the time managers will jump to conclusions or make assumptions based on a colleague's character. So this is why it's important to have somebody impartial to complete the investigation to add that fresh and clear perspective. A case we supported on quite a while ago now, there was a racial comment had been made within a work setting. The witness notes all confirmed something inappropriate was said, but neither the witnesses nor the investigation manager could properly outline what exactly was said word for word. This made it incredibly difficult for the hearing manager to invite a colleague to a hearing when it was unclear what had been said.
Yeah, and I remember that case, Hannah, and it really does highlight the importance of the investigation manager being very clear with those involved to get to the bottom of what actually has happened. And, you know, I know this may feel uncomfortable, especially if the comments are of a sexual or discriminatory nature, but it is important to take your time and plan ahead with these things.
I completely agree with you, Millie. It's also worth considering the following can contribute to risk management of a case at an investigation stage. So as you said, poor planning and being ill prepared for a meeting will inevitably add risk to a case, as the employees may not understand the severity of the issue. In addition, it can also elongate an investigation process if colleagues need to be re-interviewed due to the initial meeting not establishing all the facts. The investigation manager is the custodian of the disciplinary or grievance policy at the time, so it remains important that they morally act in line with the business's values and emphasise that trust and confidence that this matter adheres to the business process, ACAS guidance, but also GDPR protocols too. Delays in holding the meeting can cause anxiety for parties as well, so it's imperative that an investigation takes place quickly to defuse any potential anxiety within a workplace, along with ensuring that incidences remain confidential and not discussed as workplace gossip. A reminder should be given to all colleagues involved in the process that confidentiality is paramount, and should there be any further comments or questions that they may have, they should be directed to the investigation manager only.
Spot on. Thank you for all that detail there as well. But the question I have is, what evidence should an investigator be really looking for?
Well, firstly, it's important to understand that each investigation will be different from another investigation. We do recommend that an investigator should set out a terms of reference in advance of the investigation itself. So that's not a legal requirement, but it is really helpful for the investigation manager, as it's a documentation to help outline what's the purpose of this investigation and what is the scope of the investigation. It allows you to outline what specifically is being investigated and why. This will ensure that you as the investigator gather all of the key information and facts. The investigator should consider what sources of evidence are available. So that could be witnesses, documentation or emails, CCTV footage. The investigator should also consider the order in which the witness evidence will be taken. So for example, in a grievance situation, more often than not, it's more appropriate to speak to the complainant first, whereas in a disciplinary process, it can sometimes be more appropriate to speak to the witnesses prior to the alleged perpetrator in order for the investigator to fully establish all of the allegations before going to them. So there are sometimes situations where there are a large number of witnesses. So for example, if an incident occurred in an open plan office, say, and in those circumstances, the investigator does not necessarily need to interview all of the witnesses that witnessed the incident. They can look at just identifying some key witnesses. And if the accounts of those key witnesses, if their accounts of what took place are all consistent with each other, then the investigator can decide not to interview any further witnesses beyond that. Now, ACAS advises that if physical evidence is collected, the investigator should document what has been collected, how it's been collected, and what the findings of this evidence is. What I would say is investigators do need to consider the Data Protection Act and GDPR when carrying out investigations. So whilst that legislation does not stop you as an investigator from accessing and using information for the purpose of an investigation, the business should not be accessing or using information it keeps about employees unless there is a vital and relevant reason for it within the investigation. So just consider that. And additionally, a business should not access or use data if it contradicts the business's original purpose for obtaining that information. And that's particularly important for any kind of CCTV evidence, I would say. The business should have a clear policy which outlines what the purpose of the CCTV is. It should inform staff about the cameras, their locations, and how the footage might be used for either performance management or misconduct investigations. The legislation goes further and outlines how CCTV can be accessed and stored during the investigation and disciplinary stages as well. So be mindful of that. And again, just be careful of any written evidence that you collect throughout the investigation, and be mindful that the employee may have access to the evidence, such as through a subject access request or a tribunal process. And also just generally, employees in a disciplinary process, for example, have the right to all evidence in advance of the formal hearing. So just be mindful of what written evidence you have collected in that sense.
How long should the overall investigation take?
No, Matt, that's a tricky question. There's no fixed time scale. It's dependent on the nature of the allegations, the amount of employees who you need to be interviewing, and the complexity of the case as well. There are a lot of factors that could really impact the time scale. The investigation should be carried out as quickly as possible with no unreasonable delays, but it also needs to be thorough and thorough enough to be able to demonstrate a fair and reasonable process. The business does need to consider time constraints. So are there any individuals on leave or leaving the business, as this will then be taken into account when considering timescales. So for example, when we were talking about the investigation manager selection before and who we would choose, choosing somebody who's going on leave in 3 weeks' time probably isn't a good choice. But somebody who is, kind of, if it's a short investigation, could go, actually, they've got some leave in October. It could be that actually it's well reasonable to get that done and dusted within the time frame that they've got available. Other considerations are when the meetings will take place and where. So the meeting should typically take place within normal business hours, in their normal place of work, and within a confidential place as well, so meeting rooms, etc. The investigator may need to make reasonable adjustments for employees who may need additional support to allow them to fully take part in the process as well. So be mindful of that. If there are any delays, the investigator should document these, what the delay is and why. The investigator should also ensure that employees' expectations are managed appropriately in terms of the progress and timeframes, as well as making sure that they check in on the welfare of any employees who are impacted during the process. As I'm sure you can imagine, it can be a really stressful time. So checking in on that welfare is so important, and I'm pretty sure it will go a long way for those that are involved.
No, absolutely, and that's introducing a kind of human aspect to it as well. What I've picked up on is you referenced a fair and reasonable process. What would make the investigation unreasonable?
Okay, so there are many reasons why an investigation process can be deemed as unreasonable. So I'll take you through some examples. So one example could be deliberately seeking evidence which supports one party or goes in one party's favour. And that's self-explanatory, really. The whole purpose of an investigation is to establish all of the facts. So the investigation manager should be seeking a balanced view of what did occur. So it's important to ensure that there's an objective and impartial approach to evidence gathering, and this includes, not being biased and making sure that you are impartial throughout that process. Another example of what would make an investigation process unreasonable would be disregarding or excluding evidence without explanation. So just to clarify, it might be that the evidence is not reliable for some reason. However, when this is the case, I would recommend that the investigation manager should document what evidence is not being included and why it's not deemed reliable evidence, and also why the findings are contrary to what the piece of evidence might suggest. So, including evidence which is prejudiced to a particular party. Now, one example of this is considering spent warnings, so previous warnings which are now spent. There are certain scenarios where reviewing an employee's disciplinary history is relevant. However, businesses do need to be really careful of how much weight they give to those spent warnings when they're making any decisions, because obviously they're no longer live on the employee's file and therefore are spent. Another example of what potentially could make an investigation unreasonable would be not looking into key allegations. Now, this can commonly happen within grievance processes where there are multiple allegations or complaints from an employee within their grievance. So whilst an investigation manager can look at identifying what are the key points of the grievance, it's also important to make sure that each complaint is looked into and responded to with a clear finding. And then, Hannah's touched upon this earlier in one of the things that would make an investigation unreasonable would be unreasonable time delays. So as we've already advised, there should be no unreasonable delays. Investigations should take place as soon as possible, whilst ensuring it's still a thorough investigation. How long an investigation takes does depend on how complex the allegations are, but the investigation manager should be making sure it is a priority.
So let's say we're at a point where a manager has considered the remit of the investigation and they've gathered all the evidence. How long then is it for them to conclude the investigation?
So the next step would be for the investigation manager to review their evidence, produce their findings of the investigation based on the evidence that's been gathered. So the findings should come with a clear rationale. Why has the investigation manager made the finding that they have? And they should be referring to the evidence within this rationale and what they've reviewed. Wherever it's possible, the findings should be based on the facts that have been established rather than the balance of probability. One scenario which may make it more difficult to establish the facts is when you've got one word against another. In this instance, the investigator will usually have to make a decision based on the balance of probabilities. This does not mean that the investigator believes one colleague over another, or that they're lying about their account. However, they simply have to base their findings on things such as one account may have been more consistent than another, one party may have been able to provide more detail, or that one account was more plausible. Which account would you consider to be more credible and why?
Yeah, and in addition to that, we do strongly recommend that an investigation report is completed by the investigation manager. Now, a typical investigation report is broken into 5 sections, which I will quickly go over. So the first section would be your introduction. This is a brief summary of the circumstances which led to the investigation, and it should also include your terms of reference, which we touched upon earlier in the webinar. The second section will be to outline the investigation process itself. So it should outline how the investigation was conducted, what evidence was collected, was there any evidence not collected, and if so, why, and what witnesses were spoken to, etc. The third section will be your most in-depth section, and this will include your investigation findings. So the report should provide an overview of what the findings are, what facts have been established or not established. It should also include if there's any further information that needs to be considered. So, for example, any mitigating circumstances that need to be taken into consideration as part of those findings. Then your fourth section of the investigation report would be your conclusion. So this should include an overview of what your conclusion is and what your rationale for this is. It should also include any recommendations. So for a disciplinary process, the recommendation would usually be whether the matter should progress to a formal disciplinary hearing or not. And then with a grievance conclusion, there can be a much broader recommendation from there, such as additional training, mediation. It could also recommend disciplinary or performance management action on the back of the findings as well. And then your fifth and final section would just be your appendices. Now, this should include a full list of all evidence used within the investigation. So that would include any witness statements, documentation used during the investigation, and any relevant policies as well, which will have been referred to.
Spot on. Thank you both for all that information. Really, really helpful on the kind of meat and bones of the investigation itself. Also, if you've downloaded the handout, you'll have that for record as well. What I was thinking is, should we quickly move on to appeals now?
Yeah, absolutely. So an appeal is ultimately used to review whether a decision that's been made should be overturned or changed. As an employer, you should offer an employee the right to appeal for any formal outcome. An appeal can be submitted where an employee feels, for example, the disciplinary outcome was too severe or disproportionate to the allegation. If the employee feels there's been inconsistent treatment to others. If they feel any part of the disciplinary or grievance procedure was wrong or unfair in any way. If they feel there's been a misrepresentation of the facts that have been gathered. If they feel they've been dismissed for an unfair reason. Or also if they have new evidence to show and provide to the business. So within that, and just to clarify, an employee cannot submit an appeal just because they don't agree with the outcome. There does have to be a clear rationale behind why they want to appeal. As an employer, if you receive an appeal, you will need to look at the case again and see if the procedure was followed in a fair way, if the outcome was fair. However, unless it's obvious that the process wasn't followed correctly, this is not a rehearing of the investigation. It is just to review the process and see if it was done fairly. As a part as a part of the appeals process, you should firstly hear the appeal, then carry out any further investigations if it's necessary to do so, and then review if a different outcome is appropriate and provide that outcome in writing as soon as possible to the employee. Now, there is no legal time frame to allow an employee to appeal by. However, ACAS does recommend 5 working days from the employee receiving the outcome letter. And I just want to go back to the point that I made earlier during this session. Remember that there can be an uplift of up to 25% at a tribunal if it's found that there's been a failure to follow the minimum ACAS code of practice. And to talk through an example of that, of an employment tribunal, there is an employment tribunal case study which was Slade and Another versus Biggs and Others. Now, this case in particular, individuals had notified their employer of their pregnancies, and the owner of the hospitality venues instructed a series of actions that were held by the tribunal at first instance to be engineering their departure by making their lives deliberately difficult. And in doing so, they committed one of the most egregious acts of discrimination possible, is what the tribunal said. Now, so for the first employee, this case included a TUPE transfer where the individuals were not paid statutory maternity pay. A grievance was raised but ignored by the business. And following this, that individual did resign. Now, at their tribunal, they were awarded compensation of £23,243.50, which was uplifted by 25%. Along with £20,000 injury to feelings and £5,000 aggravated damages, which were both also uplifted by 25%. And the second individual, she was summarily dismissed for gross misconduct following a sham disciplinary process, whereby to avoid any liability for maternity pay, the business backdated the dismissal to the day before she gave birth prematurely. And this second colleague was awarded compensation of £41,375, which was uplifted again by 25%. And she also got £25,200 for injury to feelings and again £5,000 for aggravated damages, both uplifted by 25%. So aggravated damages are exceptionally awarded in, discrimination cases where there's been malice or spite, or if the individual's complaints are trivialised. The award amount for aggravated damages, it rarely exceeds £5,000, but it can be awarded. Now, in this case, as I've already said, the injury to feelings and aggravated damages, as well as the compensation award, were all uplifted by 25% for breaching the relevant ACAS code of practice. Now, both employees did also receive TUPE award for failing to inform and consult correctly, and that was just over £6,000, but they did fall out of the scope of the 25% uplift. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information and a lot of numbers, but just to put that into perspective for you as a business, when we look at the awards for these two individuals, the first employee had her total award increased from £54,243 to £66,304 with the 25% increase. And the second employee had their total award increased from £77,575, and that was increased to £95,469. And I mean, there's some astronomical figures. It's such a significant increase in award amounts, and that, to put it to you as employers, that 25% increase was only awarded simply because the employer failed to follow the minimum requirements of the ACAS code of practice. And that really does just show how important it is for you as employers to get it right and to follow those minimum requirements.
I think that's absolutely right. That's so important to follow that ACAS code of practice with the face of 25% increase. It's phenomenal given the numbers that you've just discussed there. Exactly that. I think following on from that as well, we've had a few questions. So just before we close off the session, I just want to handpick a few out that I've been looking at while we've been talking. So we'll tackle a few of those together. First one that I saw come in here was, what if a witness wants to remain anonymous?
Oh, I'll take this one, Millie, after those numbers that you've just delivered. That's a really good question to whoever put that one through. And it's one that does often come up in many cases that we do kind of manage from a disciplinary and a grievance process as well. So the first step that you would need to do as a business is firstly understand, why does that colleague want to remain anonymous? So it's important that all meetings that take place are in a confidential environment, as we discussed before. However, it's equally important to manage clear expectations of all witnesses that anything they say within this investigation meeting may be used as evidence as part of the formal hearing. It's also important that managers set clear expectations on confidentiality, as we discussed before, and that any details in the investigation must not be discussed with any other colleagues. So like I said, it's not workplace gossip, this is serious. The investigation manager should also make it very clear to a witness that the matter is serious and that their cooperation is really vital and important to the process. You should reassure the employee that there will be no victimisation or negative repercussions for them cooperating with this process. Presenting evidence anonymously, it's not an ideal route, I'll be honest, particularly within a disciplinary matter, as ultimately a fair process means the business is required to put the allegations to the employee and present them with the evidence in order for them to respond to these at hearing if there's a case to answer. However, if the business feels that there is enough reasonable grounds for the employee being concerned about any retaliation, you can give it some thought as to whether you can take their evidence out and keep their evidence in, but present it anonymously. However, it is important to be clear that whilst the business can support with anonymising the witness statements and evidence submitted, they can't do anything should it be inherently obvious who's made that statement. So quite a lot to consider with that in terms of what you would want to do next on that one, but it's a really good question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another good one that came in was, what if the colleague at the centre of the investigation won't engage or goes off sick?
Okay, I mean, so we do see it often where an employee goes off sick, and it's often triggered by the stress of the process itself or the stress of the allegations being put to the employee. So firstly, I'd say it's important to note that an employee not being fit for work doesn't necessarily automatically mean that they're not fit to attend a meeting or cooperate with the process during their absence. I think some consideration into postponing the meeting temporarily may be reasonable to consider. However, obviously, it's not appropriate to postpone indefinitely. So temporarily, but not indefinitely. And additionally, generally, if the sickness has been triggered by the process itself, then it's within everyone's interests, the employees and the businesses, to continue to progress and conclude the process, because that will ultimately prevent the employee from having those prolonged feelings, you know, and those prolonged feelings of stress and upset about the process. I think overall it is about liaison with the employee to discuss with them, understand what are the barriers of them attending, and take consideration into the employee's fitness to attend a meeting and cooperate with that process. It might be that you obtain medical guidance on the employee's fitness to cooperate with the process, or it might be that you may need to consider other options, such as supporting a telephone meeting rather than face-to-face, or allowing the employee to submit their response in writing, maybe.
Spot on. I like those last points as well, getting the medical guidance. That's good information there. Other question, we've got time for a few more just looking at it. I've got a colleague who has appealed outside of the time frame stated on the outcome letter. Do I have to hear it?
So I think this comes down to obligation versus good practice, if I'm being honest with you. And it does also depend on the individual circumstances as to why it's late. So legally, there's no obligation to accept an appeal outside the time frame provided. However, if we consider what the good practice would be, it would go in favour should it progress to a tribunal by accepting the appeal, as it shows that you're committed as an organisation to a fair process. This is not to say that you must accept a late appeal, particularly if the delay is significant and there's no good reason provided. However, it would be important to consider the details. So how far out of the time frame are we talking? Check if the employer's got a good and reasonable reason kind of as to why that they're submitting their appeal late. Was it completely outside of their control? And overall, it is important to make the decision on the individual facts and make sure that it is fair and reasonable, as we've discussed quite a bit today.
Spot on. Can't say fairer than that, I suppose. Now, another one as well is, what if an employee wants to be accompanied by a friend or their lawyer?
Okay. I mean, so this webinar has been about investigations, and legally there's no legal right to be accompanied at an investigation, as it is an informal process at that stage. However, if an employee does request to be accompanied at an investigation meeting, I would say it would be reasonable for the business to explore the request and deem if it's a reasonable one or not. Now, for formal meetings, there is a legal right to be accompanied by either someone they work with or a trade union representative. There's no legal right to be accompanied by a family member or a lawyer. Now, we do see some requests for employees to bring a family member with them, and this would be a business decision as to whether you accept that request or not. I would say it would be a reasonable approach to consider the reasons why they're asking for this. So, for example, do they have a mental health condition and need that moral support there for them? Ultimately, it is a business decision, though, whether you accept that. Now, separately, for employees asking to bring a lawyer with them, again, there's no legal right for them to bring a lawyer with them, but it would be reasonable for the business to consider the reasons why the employee is requesting this. So, for example, does an employee, if an employee has a disability, that would potentially make it difficult for them to put their case forward coherently. Would it be reasonable then to support a request for a lawyer? We do sometimes come across cases with requests for lawyers to accompany employees in regulated services. So we're looking at financial services, teaching profession, the medical profession, for example. And sometimes it may be appropriate to consider this request, particularly if the outcome goes beyond, our usual remit, which would be just dismissal. So, for example, if that outcome would also then impact on, them losing their license to practice within their profession, for example, then potentially it may be appropriate to consider allowing them to have their lawyer present. But fundamentally, there is absolutely no right to bring a lawyer. And I do think that, those requests are for the more extreme circumstances where, it would be considered by a business.
Yeah, especially you mentioned there in the professional arena, you can imagine why some may want legal representation, but again, it's just down to circumstance, I suppose, isn't it? I'm starting to waffle. I've got another question here, and it'll be the final one with time. Is, can I decline to hear an appeal if the employee just disagrees with the outcome?
We've had a couple of these. We can technically decline to hear an appeal if the employee appeals because they just don't agree with it. However, as an employer, it is really important to understand why they don't agree with the outcome, because there may be some genuine grounds for an appeal within them not agreeing with the outcome as well. So, as kind of Millie discussed before about they've now found some evidence they wanted to submit, or they don't kind of agree with how the process is rolled out, etc. So in the first instance, I'd recommend going back to the employee and exploring and asking them to clarify exactly what their grounds for the appeal are. and what the reasons are that they do or do not agree with the outcome, and kind of whether it may just be an instance, Matt, where actually they just need the outcome explaining to them a little bit more. Maybe that rationale hasn't sunk in a little bit. So it may be that you could just kind of do it in that type of meeting, of a further outcome meeting, rather than going through another appeal. But yeah,
just kind of emphasising the original outcome really in that instance.
exactly.
That makes sense. People just want clarification of actually what's happened. Brilliant. Super. Well, I think there were some brilliant questions to round off a brilliant webinar. I've learned quite a lot, to be honest with you, through this process. So thank you both for the valuable session that we've held today. Now, again, I will mention, if we weren't able to cover off all questions, unfortunately, we will be in touch with you directly afterwards to give you, individual answers to those questions that we asked. They are important to us, so they will be answered. Hannah, really on behalf of everybody here and myself today, just thank you for your insight and all the practical guidance and the wealth of experience that you've brought to today's session. So thank you again, very much so. A few things just before we do wrap up though. Don't worry, we've got you covered here at Sage. So if you'd like help with anything that we've covered, please feel free to check out any of the topics in the Sage HR Advice portal, or alternatively, if you're a professional premium customer, please do not hesitate to call the advice line. One of our consultants will be more than happy to provide guidance on any of the topics covered today, or anything else that you may need help with. And just to let you know as well, Sage HR Advice is here to help you navigate and simplify these kind of scenarios that you face as well. Alongside Sage HR, you can automate and simplify tasks, calculate holiday entitlements, etc., as well as other things with regarding to your day-to-day HR requirements and needs. So something to consider. Now, a couple more things in relation to HR Advice and Sage HR. Sage HR Advice is here to help you navigate, as I said before, those proposed changes and anything else that could affect your day-to-day HR requirements and needs. I'm going to be running a poll soon, and in that poll I want you to answer yes or no if you'd like to receive more information on either Sage HR Advice or Sage HR in general. But we have webinar recordings of some of the different modules of Sage HR if you're interested in knowing more about them, and you can go to sage.co.uk/webinars. Now, I would highly recommend you getting more information on these. I'm going to be running that poll momentarily, but first, we're encouraging to have your say. So let us know what topics you would like to see. Pop in your suggestions into the questions panel that we have active, but also submit your feedback afterwards. We send out feedback forms and we read absolutely every single comment. Trust me, we do, because we want to know your thoughts and your opinions, what you want covered, what you want to go into detail on. Even if it's just a further question that you've got, we will be in contact with you and we will reply to you. But it's very important to us that you fill in those forms and give us your honest opinion. We also have other webinars. So you'll see in front of you here, we've got regular webinars in Sage 50 payroll, report selections on the 17th of September, timesheet entry on the 19th of September, mastering mistakes on the 24th of September, and variance reporting on the 26th of September. Again, go to sage.co.uk/webinars. We have a wealth more of webinars available for you to get registered to, or you can watch the previous recordings as mentioned. Now, what I'm going to do is open this poll for those of you who'd like to receive more information on Sage HR Advice or Sage HR. It's so hard for me to say Sage HR Advice today. I have to put my teeth in. But that poll is going to be on your screen momentarily. I'll leave it up there for just a minute, and I'll be back with you shortly. Superb, excellent, brilliant. So we gathered all the votes in there. We will be in touch with you after the webinar has concluded, which I must tell you sadly is now. So thank you very much again, Hannah and Millie, for your attendance today. It's been absolutely wonderful. If you could fill in the survey for us, that would be fantastic. But hopefully we shall see you at the next one, which is on the 9th of October. See you soon. Bye for now.
Bye.